For today's class, you're going to want to have your coneflowers, all the petals painted once using water and then dropping in the color. And you also want to have your masking applied on the left-hand side of each of the centers, placing it in an arc. Today we're going to be learning how to take our masking off our paper. And remember, when you're applying masking, you need the paper to be perfectly dry. Sometimes you'll put masking on top of an area that you've already painted, and you just want to make sure that that has completely dried before you apply the masking. It's also a really good idea to let that paper dry for a few days so that the pigments have a chance to really stain the paper. Because if you do mask over an area that you've previously painted, when you take that masking off, it will take some of the paint with it. So it's perfectly dry when you put the masking on, and it needs to be perfectly dry when you take the masking off. I just rub the masking with my finger, and then you can grab a little piece of it and pull that away from the paper. They do make rubber mask removers that you can find at almost any art supply store, whether a brick and mortar or an online store, because your fingers actually have oils in them. And so you really don't want to touch your watercolor paper too much. But I'm not a purist, so I just go ahead and use my finger to rub it off, and then I just try to remember to pull most of it. We'll be talking about splattering later. Sometimes I splatter my masking fluid, and I do that to suggest snow in a painting. So I wanted to show you that while I was putting together this little masking fluid part of the demo. Next, we're going to move on to working with a palette knife. This is the palette knife that I'll be using today. You can see that it's a little crooked. Sometimes I use these to dig pigment out of my palette, but this is a very nice size. Unfortunately, it's so old I can't read what size it is, but I have many palette knives in many different sizes, but I thought this would be a good size for today's project. Obviously, a bigger painting would use a bigger knife. I'm going to be demonstrating for you how to paint birch trees using the palette knife, and I'm mixing up a nice rich puddle of burnt sienna, and then I'm going to add some French ultramarine blue to that burnt sienna to make a darker brown. You'll notice that I had a little red on my palette, the permanent rose, but that's fine. I don't mind that. I like to have a variety of color. I'm going to take my palette knife and we're going to push right into that puddle of pigment. And I'm trying to get a nice little bead of paint right on the edge of my palette knife. I'll then take it over to my tree, set it at an angle, and drag across. I can load the opposite side of my palette knife to make marks coming in from the other side of the tree. Let's see. This is a really fun way to do quick and easy birch trees. If I lift up a little bit on my knife, I can get a thinner mark, and pressing down, I get a thicker mark. Notice as I'm placing these marks on the tree, I'm making them curve. I'm dragging the knife down toward me and then pushing back up. The reason for that is that I'm trying to suggest that this is a round shape, but once again, we're only working on a flat two-dimensional surface. So I use that shape to encourage my viewer to see this as a rounded form. So that's a nice way to get some interesting shapes onto a piece of paper to suggest a birch tree. I can also use the tip of the brush, or excuse me, the palette knife, to drag away and create branches. I love that the palette knife makes a much more irregular shape than I would be able to create with a brush. Remember, not all your branches are going to come off the sides of the trees. Sometimes they'll come off in the center of the tree, and you can really help that to look more realistic by softening it right where it comes into the tree and help it look more like a branch coming off the tree. Which brings me to my next demo, and that is the script liner. Sometimes I'll use a script liner to create the branches on my trees. And it does a decent job. You'll notice when I'm painting with a script liner, I've got my little finger balanced on my paper. And it helps me to then use my wrist to change the angle of that brush. Always nice to see things overlapping one another in your paintings. Always nice to be able to charge in a variety of color. So those are some quick and easy birch trees. Using a palette knife and using a script liner to paint them. And remembering to overlap our shapes. I also use my script liner as my signature. The script liner is really good for any kind of calligraphy type work or line work that you need to do on your painting. And again, when I'm using that script liner, I tend to put my little finger down. I create my S, the D, and then that's the little dot over the I. And that's my current signature for my paintings. You can also use the script liner to create nice spirals, round shapes. It's a brush that you'll have to take some time practicing with, but it's a really great brush for details and line work. You don't have to balance your hand up on your little finger like I do. I've just found that works well for me. So those are some of the things that I do with my script liner and with the palette knife. I want to have you base in a couple of the shapes for our next class. We're going to be talking about stenciling, and I'm going to show you how to lift with a stencil and how to paint with a stencil. So we're going to want to put one side. I've divided my stencil grid into two sections, and I want you to paint one of those sections today. It's a great opportunity to try some charging. You want some pretty rich color. Notice it's not super thin. I also want you to take your scraping section and divide that into two halves and paint one half of your scraping section. It doesn't matter which side you paint. Another technique that I wanted to discuss with you guys today, and I mentioned it earlier, is splattering. And I use splattering a lot. If you look at the project that we're going to be doing next, the pears, it's a still life, they have little specks on them, and I created those specks by splattering. Now when you're going to splatter, you can protect other parts of your painting by laying out some paper towel. And when I'm going to splatter, I load my brush well, and then I just flick and tap the paint onto the paper. Now, the harder I tap, the bigger the splatters are going to be. But the longer I stay at it, the splatters get finer and smaller. So if you wanted smaller, finer splatters, you could start by splattering on your palette. And then when you get to the size you want, move your brush over to your painting. You can also use your script liner to connect some of those splatters. You know, if I wanted to, I could suggest a fall tree by splattering some orange and some red and some yellow. And those could become the tree, the leaves. And I can come back with my script liner and put in the branches. So that's a nice way to use these two techniques in tandem. Remember that your branches are going to be thicker where they start and finer as they move away from the form. Always want to avoid the pitchfork, not having three coming out at the same spot. And think about overlapping your shapes. So those are your techniques for this class. Next, we're going to work a little bit more on our coneflower. So you have your coneflower painted, and all the petals have one coat of paint. And we've decided that our light is coming from the upper left. And I brought this in to show you a more finished version. Notice how all the petals that are in the light are not as dark as the petals that are in shadow. We achieve that by painting all the petals on the left-hand side one more time. Now, in this particular painting, my light is coming from the left, so I'm going to darken the petals that are on the right. And I'll do that by taking the brush. I'm going to do it exactly the same way that we painted the petals initially. Oops, I've splattered. I meant to mention, if you do splatter in an area that you don't want any splatter, you can just take a paper towel and lift it up. As long as you see it and you get to it in time, it's not an issue. But it is nice to try to protect those. So I've mixed up a little bit of the permanent rose. And on the shadow side of my flower, I'm going to paint every other leaf again with water. And then I'll come back and touch in the color at the top and at the tip. And I'll let the water on the paper move the pigment to give me a nice soft edge. So I'll probably do those 3 or 4 on this one. And then coming down to the other flower, I'll do every other petal, probably just 3. Tap in the color, let the water pull the pigment, and walk away. Oh, I see I got a little bit of paint down here too. So I'll just use a little water and pick that up. For our last step today, we're going to work in our centers. You'll probably want to wait until these petals have dried, but I'm just going to go ahead and demo this for you. We're going to need a puddle of yellow pigment, our puddle of red pigment, and a puddle of blue, probably a nice dark blue, like ultramarine. I don't know if you can see that over there, so I'll put it over here. And what you're going to do is, starting on the side that's the lightest, you're going to lay in your yellow, and you're putting the color in a curved shape, and you want to come almost to the middle, halfway across. You don't have to clean your brush, but you can if you need to. Pick up some of your red and moving a little bit further to the right, paint in your red and then touch it back into your yellow. Notice as I'm painting, I'm also leaving some of those little white shapes of what would be the texture of this flower. They're kind of fuzzy. And then I'm going to come back with my blue and touch that in the furthest corner and then down underneath, suggesting the roundness of the form of that flower. We're not going to put a little more red in there. This is not the final time we'll be working in this area, but this is just our first time in. I'll do the second bud for you now. I'm going to paint with my yellow to start, coming almost halfway, painting in a curve. Pick up my red, push it back into that yellow. Don't be afraid to leave a couple little pieces of white of the paper showing. And then pick up our blue. Put that a little bit along the bottom and on the furthest right hand side. And that's your class for today. Enjoy!